Evan Parker never thought a single raindrop could carry the weight of a nightmare. But on that grim November morning, when the sky hung low and the world smelled of wet asphalt and antiseptic, he pushed his frail mother, Linda Parker, through the automatic doors of Riverview Oncology, unaware that the greatest threat to her life wasn't the aggressive lymphoma eating away at her body, but a twisted mind lurking far closer than he'd ever imagined. Linda, wrapped in her thinning blue blanket, managed a weak smile as she whispered, "At least it's warm in here," her voice trembling more from exhaustion than cold, and Evan squeezed her hand, trying to hide the guilt that had gnawed at him for months since moving her into his home after her diagnosis. Guilt that intensified every time chemotherapy drained her like a wilting flower. He thought their worst battles were the midnight fevers, the choking nausea, the nights he'd find her trembling on the bathroom floor. But that was before Marjorie Hensley, the HOA president with a smile tight enough to crack glass, started showing up in places she didn't belong, beginning with the day she marched up his driveway with a clipboard and a complaint about unsightly medical equipment, lowering the neighborhood's curb appeal. Marjorie wasn't the kind of HOA busybody who handed out warnings over overgrown lawns or holiday decorations. She had a strange stillness in her eyes, a cold calculation that made neighbors lower their voices and close their doors. And though Evan tried to shrug off her behavior as typical HOA nonsense, he couldn't ignore how she'd linger a little too long whenever she saw Linda on the porch, how her gaze would trail to the chemotherapy port beneath his mother's collarbone, like she was studying it, memorizing it, cataloguing it as if it was some grotesque flaw in the community aesthetic. That morning, as they waited for room 214 to open, Evan could feel something off. An odd tension in the clinic, whispers from nurses, a sense that someone had moved something but nobody wanted to say what. Then, as if summoned by that unease, Marjorie appeared, stepping into the oncology hallway like she belonged there, her umbrella dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, her face stretching into a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she purred, "Oh, Evan, fancy seeing you here," pretending she had come to ask about an HOA dues discrepancy, but refusing to leave even when he told her this wasn't the time, not when Linda was minutes away from chemotherapy and barely conscious enough to speak. Nurse Michelle Rowan, a soft-spoken woman with sharp instincts, finally intervened, gently but firmly escorting Marjorie out of the restricted hallway after noticing how the woman had leaned over Linda's shoulder, her gaze fixed not on the frail woman's face but directly at the chemo port under her skin. And when Marjorie stepped away, she muttered something under her breath, something Evan couldn't fully catch except for the chilling fragment. Some people shouldn't linger. The chemo session itself felt routine, almost too routine. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, nurses whispered updates, machines beeped in steady rhythms, but Evan couldn't shake the image of Marjorie's fingers brushing the edge of Linda's IV stand as Michelle guided her away. After the appointment, the rain had stopped, but the wind carried a biting chill as they drove home, and for a moment Evan let himself believe that maybe it had all been nothing more than HOA paranoia clashing with his frayed nerves. Yet later, that evening, as Linda sat on the couch trying to sip warm broth, her face suddenly went pale. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed against Evan's chest, her pulse fluttering like a moth trapped in a glass jar. In the ER, machines shrieked as doctors rushed around her, shouting terms Evan couldn't process. Systemic air, embolism risk, possible air introduction. And as they stabilized her, a thin-faced resident pulled Evan outside and explained that a small amount of air had somehow entered her bloodstream. It wasn't enough to kill her, but it was enough to cause collapse. It happens sometimes during routine chemo, the resident said, an accidental bubble in the line. But Michelle, who had rushed to the ER after hearing the commotion, stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. As Evan sat beside his unconscious mother, Michelle finally approached him, her voice low but steady as she said, "Evan, I need you to think carefully. Did anyone touch your mother's line today? Anyone who shouldn't have?" Evan tried to answer, but the memory slammed into him, Marjorie leaning over Linda's shoulder, her fingers brushing the IV pole, her eyes locked on the chemo port, with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And as he whispered her name, Michelle's expression hardened. The kind of hardened that comes from a nurse who has seen too much and knows when something isn't an accident. She took a deep breath, glanced down the hallway to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer and said the words that would fracture the world Evan thought he understood. Someone did this deliberately. And in that moment, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the ER, with machines humming and the faint smell of disinfectant choking the air, Evan realized this was no longer about cancer, treatment, or survival. This was the beginning of a war waged by someone who didn't just want control over the neighborhood, but wanted his mother gone entirely. A sociopath hiding behind HOA bylaws and polite smiles, waiting for her next opportunity. Daniel Reed had always believed that fear had a distinct sound, like the sharp inhale before a scream or the metallic click of a locked door. But after what happened to his mother Grace, fear became something else, entirely. A thick, suffocating presence that clung to every corner of their home, making even the quietest night feel like a trap waiting to spring. Grace's near-death collapse at the clinic should have pushed the world to slow down, but instead it spun faster, darker, as if someone had knocked the balance off its axis, because while doctors attempted to comfort Daniel with talk of rare chemo line accidents, oncology nurse Hannah Doyle wasn't buying any of it, and her instincts, sharpened by years of watching vigilant families and careless patients, told her that Grace's embolism wasn't some fluke, but a deliberate act committed by someone who understood exactly how air could be introduced into a port without leaving visible traces. Daniel tried to dismiss the thought at first. After all, who would target a dying woman? But then Hannah said something that made his entire world tilt. "Someone gained access to your mother's room who didn't belong there," she whispered, holding a tablet showing a time-stamped hallway camera where a blurred figure, broad-shouldered, moving with eerie calm, slipped into the chemo wing on a day Grace wasn't scheduled for treatment. And before Daniel could ask questions, the figure turned just enough for the light to catch on something familiar. The rigid posture, the immaculate coat, the perfect helmet of hair that belonged unmistakably to Caroline Mercer, the HOA president, who had spent the past year treating Daniel and Grace like unwelcome intruders in their own neighborhood. Caroline wasn't just strict or overbearing. She was the kind of woman who measured grass length with a ruler, photographed garbage cans left out for more than 5 minutes, and once threatened to fine Grace for displaying medical clutter because her oxygen concentrator tubing was visible through the window. Though Daniel had always brushed her off as another heartless HOA tyrant, seeing her near the chemo facility sent a cold electric shock down his spine, because Caroline lived 40 minutes away from Riverview Oncology and had absolutely no reason to be there, not unless she was following them. Hannah began digging deeper, reviewing staff access logs, security badges, and treatment room assignments, only to discover another anomaly. Someone had manually overridden the lock on Grace's treatment bay 20 minutes before her collapse, and the override came from a badge registered to a volunteer who hadn't shown up that entire week. It was enough evidence to raise alarms, but not enough to get police involved. Not yet. Meanwhile, Caroline's behavior in the neighborhood grew more disturbing. She slipped notes under Daniel's door complaining that terminal patients create emotional pollution and warning him that visible suffering diminishes property desirability. Words so cold and calculated they made Daniel reread them 3 times just to confirm they were real. Grace tried to remain calm, insisting Caroline was just an unwell woman with too much power. But even she flinched whenever the doorbell rang, and on one particularly stormy evening, Daniel found her staring out the window with trembling, hands whispering that she felt like someone was watching the house. The next day, as Daniel prepared to take Grace for her scheduled chemo session, her knees buckled in the hallway, her lips turning a frightening shade of blue. He caught her, just before she fell, but her pulse was faint, thready, like it was trying to slip away again. Rushing her back to the ER, Daniel demanded answers, and this time the attending physician confirmed the unthinkable. Another small air bubble had entered her bloodstream. 2 air embolisms in the same week doesn't happen accidentally, he said, voice grim. Hannah overheard it and marched Daniel to a private room, pulling up a new security clip she had uncovered. Caroline, wearing a beige trench coat and carrying a folded newspaper, walking through a staff-only door behind a distracted volunteer, her steps steady, her presence too confident for someone who didn't belong there. But what made Daniel's blood run cold was the final frame, zoomed in on Caroline's hand, where she held a small piece of medical tubing, the same type used for chemo line flushing. "She didn't come here by mistake," Hannah said, her expression tight with anger. "She came here prepared." Daniel felt the room tilt, the air thicken as panic and rage collided inside him. This wasn't just harassment or cruelty, or HOA overreach. This was obsession, dangerous, targeted obsession, and Caroline was escalating. Back home, evidence of her intrusion began surfacing everywhere. The backyard gate left open, footprints near Grace's bedroom window. Even Daniel's car hood lifted as if someone had tampered with it. Neighbors started whispering too. Mark, from 2 houses down, mentioned seeing Caroline photographing their driveway late at night, while another neighbor swore she heard Caroline muttering about cleaning up the neighborhood's weak links. Grace's health worsened. She coughed more, slept less, and her hands shook whenever she reached for water, terrified that at any moment her body might betray her again because someone else wanted it to. Hannah, unable to stay silent anymore, warned Daniel that Caroline wasn't just dangerous, she was intelligent, calculating every move, exploiting every loophole, studying every vulnerability like she was preparing for a final strike. The last straw came when Daniel received an email from the HOA claiming he owed a violation fee for creating a depressive visual impact due to ongoing medical decline. A phrase so cruel, so inhuman, he almost threw his laptop across the room. That's when Hannah called, her voice trembling with urgency as she said, "Daniel, you need to listen. I reviewed the footage again. Caroline wasn't just here during your mom's chemo. She was watching me too." Daniel asked what she meant, and Hannah explained she had spotted Caroline standing in the parking lot, staring directly at her, unmoving, expression blank, as if silently warning her to stop investigating. Hannah took a shaky breath, and then delivered the line that cemented the horror of everything. "Your HOA president is trying to kill your mother, and she knows I'm watching her." The words hung in Daniel's mind like a noose tightening around his sanity. Because if Caroline knew she was being tracked, and if she was bold enough to infiltrate a medical facility twice, there was no telling what she would try next or how far she would go before Daniel could stop her. Michael Grant had never understood how terror could settle into a house like smoke, clinging to the walls long after the danger left, but after weeks of watching his mother Eleanor fade between life and death because of a woman who should have been nothing more than an HOA annoyance, he learned that true fear doesn't scream, it whispers, it stalks, it bides its time. Patricia Lowell had crossed every boundary, every moral line, every inch of humanity. Morphing from a petty HOA enforcer into something predatory and calculated, and by the time Michael realized she wasn't just harassing them, but actively trying to kill Eleanor, it was already too late to pretend they could reason with someone like her. The morning of the final confrontation began deceptively calm, sunlight breaking through the blinds in soft golden streams as Eleanor dozed on the couch, her skin pale and fragile, her breathing shallow but steady. Alyssa Hart, the oncology nurse who had become their guardian angel in disguise, called Michael with a voice edged in urgency. She had uncovered something terrifying. Security footage showed Patricia entering the oncology wing again, this time wearing disguised scrubs, a cap pulled low and moving with chilling certainty. Like she had rehearsed the infiltration 100 times, Alyssa warned Michael not to come yet, because she was already following Patricia through the restricted hallway, her badge clutched in her hand, and her heart pounding in her ears as she crept after a woman who had blended so seamlessly into the medical environment, it made Alyssa's stomach twist. Meanwhile, at home, Michael noticed something off. An uneasy stillness, the kind that makes birds stop chirping and the air feel electrically charged. When he stepped outside to take out the trash, he froze as he noticed Patricia's car parked halfway down the street, angled toward his house like a predator waiting for its prey's final breath. Panic surged through his chest, and without thinking, he locked up the house, bundled Eleanor into the car, and sped toward the oncology center. Because if Patricia was at the clinic, then she was preparing for her final attempt, the fatal injection that would leave Eleanor gone before anyone realized something had been done. At Riverview Oncology, Alyssa's worst fears materialized right before her eyes. Patricia slipped into treatment room 12, the room Eleanor always used, moving with eerie calm, her gloved hand already holding a syringe prepped with dangerous intent, the kind of invisible murder weapon that left minimal trace if used correctly. Alyssa's breath hitched when Patricia lifted the chemo tubing, tapping it with mechanical precision as she whispered, "Some burdens must be removed for a neighborhood to thrive." That line, so chillingly casual, snapped Alyssa out of her shock, and she lunged into the room, shouting, "Drop it!" Her voice echoed through the sterile hallway, and Patricia spun around, her eyes dark with an emotion that didn't resemble fear or anger. It was pure annoyance, like she had been interrupted during an important chore. The syringe slipped from Patricia's fingers, clattering to the floor as Alyssa hit the emergency code button on the wall, triggering alarms that flashed red across the entire wing. Just then, Michael burst through the doors, breathless, sweat-soaked, and wild-eyed, running toward the treatment area as security scrambled in confusion. When he reached room 12, he found Alyssa standing between Patricia and the chemo chair like a human shield, her hands trembling, but her expression unflinching, while Patricia stared back with a twisted sense of righteousness carved into her perfectly composed face. "She was going to inject air into the line," Alyssa cried, pointing at the syringe on the floor. "She was seconds away." Patricia didn't deny it. She simply tilted her head and spoke with a calmness that made Michael's blood run ice-cold. "A dying woman brings down a community's spirit. I'm preserving the neighborhood's value." The words were so monstrous, so far removed from sanity, Michael felt something inside him shatter. He stepped forward, fists clenched, but Alyssa threw out an arm to stop him as security finally swarmed the room, pinning Patricia against the wall while she continued to mutter about bylaws, property standards, and removing detrimental influences. Police arrived minutes later, handcuffing her while reading charges that echoed through the halls. Attempted manslaughter, medical facility intrusion, assault with a deadly instrument. And yet Patricia didn't struggle. She simply smiled, a cold, empty smile that suggested she still believed she had done nothing wrong. As officers dragged her away, Michael rushed to Eleanor, who was still in the lobby, too weak to walk far, and collapsed beside her, burying his face into her, shoulder in relief as she whispered, "It's over, sweetheart. It's really over." Though both of them felt a shadow still lingering, like Patricia's presence had seeped into their world too deeply to be erased so easily. Eleanor's health slowly stabilized in the following weeks, her color returning. Faintly, her breathing growing stronger as the fear that had hollowed their home began to fade. Neighbors, once silent out of intimidation, brought meals, flowers, and quiet apologies for not intervening sooner. Michael packed up their belongings and arranged for them to move across the state to a peaceful community with no HOA, hoping never again to hear the cold echo of bylaws or compliance forms used as weapons. But just days before they left, Michael opened the HOA email account one last time, intending to delete everything, and froze when he saw a new message, one scheduled automatically weeks before Patricia's arrest. The subject line read, "Final notice." His hands shaking, he opened it, and the single sentence inside made the room go still. "This neighborhood will never escape me." A chill swept down his spine, not because Patricia could hurt them again, she was locked away, facing years behind bars, but because the message was proof of something far more haunting. She had planned this for months, perhaps longer, and, in her mind, the war wasn't over. As Michael closed the laptop and exhaled shakily, he realized their story might have ended, but Patricia's shadow would live in memory forever, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't strangers. They're neighbors who smile, wave, and hide their darkness behind HOA authority until the day they finally strike.